and follow the show on Facebook. Now, in the last few years, everyone knows Australia's media landscape has undergone some pretty dramatic changes. International players like The Guardian, The New York Times, BuzzFeed have all established bureaus in Australia. And last year's Nine Fairfax merger was just the latest in a series of seismic shifts. New research conducted by the BBC has explored the way the shake-ups like these have affected Australia's attitude towards the media. According to the Beeb, up to 74% of Australians believe there's been an increase in agenda-driven news over the last few years. 59% are worried this will lead to a loss of impartial journalism and credible news. Almost 90% of Australians believe that the role of media outlets is to deliver news they can trust. But 2/3 of people believe that these news organisations are driven more by commercial interests than they are the delivery of accurate and impartial reportage. And almost half of us admit that we often struggle to see the agendas that might be at play. So in a second I'll grab the panel's opinions, but first we're joined now from London by the BBC's CEO of Global News, Mr Jim Egan. Jim, thank you so much for joining us. In a nutshell, what does your research tell us?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of headlines coming out today, Adam, but the two big ones for us are that in Australia, 2/3 of Australians are now concerned that news organisations are more concerned about their commercial goals than trustworthy and reliable news. And 3/4 of Australians see a trend over the last 5 years of news becoming more agenda-driven. Now, this wasn't a cross-country study, but nevertheless, as part of our rolling research program, we would say these numbers are somewhat and interestingly high. And I guess there are some reasons for that to do with debates about media plurality and diversity being at the forefront in Australia in the last couple of years with the changes in media ownership laws and some of the transactions that have happened subsequently. And then, of course, there are wider global trends, concerns about fake news, about changes in the media landscape at a time when news is trying to report and keep up with international events and political realignment that most of us haven't seen before in our working lives.
It's fascinating because at the same time in Australia, as I explained, you've had new players entering the market. I know a lot of people who'd never read a word in the New York Times or the Washington Post until fairly recently. Now it's only a tap on your phone away.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that in some of the transactions that have happened in Australia over the last 12 months or so, you've seen organisations like the ACCC being conscious of actually a broadening and a widening media landscape. And there is new entry happening in the market, and the BBC is very proud to play a part with our online service, bbc.com. But at the same time, I think there is still a recognition, and you see this consistently in surveys, that the role that traditional broadcast outlets play alongside print organisations and the perceptions of trust and the expectations of reliability that audiences have for those outlets is different from many of the social media players where time and time again you see, although social media has grown significantly as a way in which many people are getting their news, the levels of trustworthiness and reliability of social media is markedly lower.
Another one I found fascinating, that almost half of people surveyed admitted that while they know some news agencies might have agendas, they're not particularly good themselves at spotting those agendas when they are at play.
Yeah, that's right. And this is something that, again, in our research and our work around the world, that we perceive that the rise of social media and new ways of gaining access to information has been really phenomenal in recent years. But nevertheless, people are unsure who they can trust. They want to know more about the background of organisations and what the agenda really is. And there is work that we're doing around the world this year, in particular as we run up to major elections in Nigeria next month, in India in a couple of months, and also in Australia later on this year. There's a lot of work that we are doing, particularly at big moments of political discourse and decision like national elections, to try to play a positive role in giving people a perspective on the world and also on national events that they can really rely on.
Tasneem, let me bring you in here. A quick look at your website says you featured on The Guardian, The Australian, The Age, SBS Life, BBC's IQ2 Debates, Q&A, The Project, Compass, ABC Radio, and of course here on The Drum. You've experienced a fair swathe of Australian media. Do these findings surprise you at all?
No, not really. I think people are justifiably sceptical about what's being thrown at them. I think there's also a tendency then to from the networks that I collaborate with, there's a tendency to want to compare the news that you get. So if there's a reliance on only one form of media and one form of news and news receivership, then you can actually get a very skewed analysis. So in my experience, it's important to read and peer broadly so that you can actually get a sense of both sides of a story.
And Rob, 74% of Australians believe there's been an increase in agenda-driven news over the last few years. Is it fair to say that Junkie is an agenda-driven news agency? And explain it in 25 words how it actually works for people who aren't familiar.
I mean, I think agenda is kind of a sinister word. You know, if anything, our agenda is evident in the stories that we choose to cover and the stories that we don't choose to cover. You know, we talk about issues that matter to our audience. It's a young audience, it's a progressive audience. You know, we talk about climate change. We talked a lot about marriage equality during the campaign. We talk a lot about fair pay for young workers. These are issues that matter to our audience. So our agenda is bringing the news to our audience that they actually care about.
You don't really break the news yourself as much as curate what's out there for your readers. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. You know, we're a very small organisation. We don't have people out on the front lines. We don't have people down in Canberra. What we try to do is take news as it happens, you know, take the events that are unfolding in Canberra, talk about the issues that matter to our audience and put it in a little bit of context, explain it to our audience, give them a bit more kind of background because, you know, young people today, our audience, they're not getting the newspaper dropped on the front door of their doorstep every morning. They're getting it in their Facebook feeds.
But on something like marriage equality, where your organisation has one particular side, did you print many opinion pieces giving the case against marriage equality?
No, not at all, and didn't feel any obligation to.
So does that make you a news vehicle if you don't present one side of the story?
I covered that a lot personally, and I've been covering that for a decade. When I was writing a news piece, I certainly would contact the No Side for a gay journalist who's been writing about this for years. I had a surprisingly good relationship with the No Side. I don't know if I do anymore. I don't think I'm on Lyle Shelton's Christmas card list anymore. But, you know, I didn't feel any obligation to give their kind of nonsense points a platform. You know, a lot of the No campaign was, you know, outright lies or nonsense or was, you know, completely irrelevant to the actual debate. And so, no, I felt no obligation to put that on my website.
Jennifer, the Australian news landscape at the moment, traditional players like yourself, new players like Rob's, is there this agenda-driven news more than there was 5 years ago?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that there is, in part because the rise of social media and a whole lot of people like Rob's organisation do have kind of clear agendas. But again, I mean, these are judgmental words. I do think one of the big issues in the change in journalism is that instead of having a broad range of topics that are covered, people do tend and can choose just to follow the people that they like or the particular organisations, publications that they like. And so that kind of reinforces, I think, the lack of challenge or diversity in views often, despite the fact that there's, logically, you think there may be many more.
Tasneem, at a time when people think certain organisations might have certain lines they're more likely to favour, how do people bring themselves out, expose themselves to the full range of opinions? How do you find out where the truth lies?
I think fact-checking. Fact-checking's become the new investigative tool that people can just reach out to, again, on their phone, on their devices. You can verify things, you can scrutinise things in a way that, 30, 40 years ago was impossible. So the mainstream media is being held to account now by citizen journalists, citizen investigators, and I think that has changed the playing field.
Jim, can I bring you in there for a second? It's interesting because you say there's a level of lack of trust in some of the newer players, the social players.
The radio output that they are consuming, and stories that we report on where actually people have very, very low levels in trust in some of the TV and the radio output that they are consuming. But I think the positive thing that's coming out is as we see a series of seismic events unfolding around the world, audiences are becoming interested in and engaged not just in politics but also in news in a way which is unprecedented. And for all of us who are committed to serious journalism in one form or another, I think this is actually really quite promising and quite encouraging at a time when nevertheless the economics of the industry are very, very tough and harsh. And it's I suppose the coincidence of sort of that rise of interest in an appetite for news with the difficulty of funding, whether that's public funding or commercial funding, which is bringing some of these very, very difficult issues to the fore.
On the topic of funding, Jennifer, I posted something recently that linked to a site that had a paywall, and the first response was, how am I meant to know what that's about? It's behind a paywall, to which lots of people responded, yeah, mate, pay for it. Have Australians got to the point now where we're willing to pay for what's behind the paywall, or is there still that natural aversion, if it's online, I demand that it's free?
Well, I think that is gradually changing, and speaking as somebody who's employed for a commercial organisation, so I'm glad that it is the case. But I do think one of the issues there is people have realised that good journalism does cost. Bad journalism doesn't tend to cost much at all, and therefore, if you're going to want it to trust something and good journalism, people I think are more inclined to pay. But it's still a very difficult business. It's still very difficult, kind of commercially, to make that pay, because in the end, the advertising model, which used to sustain commercial journalism, has been replaced by subscribers only, because most of the advertising dollars has gone to Google and Facebook.
Tasneem, if I'm dealing with an online organisation that I'm getting for free, how in this modern media marketplace can that have the time to fact check, to do long-form investigative journalism, to hold itself to the highest of standards in this clickbait era?
Well, I think Jen hit it on the head. I mean, if those online sources relying on advertising and they're not getting it, then subscription is the only way to actually, broaden your reach to some really more nuanced, broad form journalism. It becomes an ethical dilemma, doesn't it? Do you pay for knowledge, information that is actually going to be comprehensive and actually invaluable, or do you just take what's coming at you for free and know that it's not really going to be the full story, but it's it's convenient?
Rob, you worked for BuzzFeed for a while. They're as famous for its listicles as it is for its news pieces. Can you really take an organisation seriously that's also giving you the top 10 tips that Kendall Jenner has dyed her hair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at BuzzFeed when I worked there, and still today, there's a huge separation between what they call the news and the buzz side. I think the buzz side is the thing that drives most of the traffic. I think it's what pays most of the bills. But what it also does is pays for a fantastic news team to break a lot of news. And I think if you look at what BuzzFeed's done in Australia over the last few years, they've broken a lot of stories. They've done a lot of really important coverage of big issues. And that's paid for by the fun stuff. That's paid for by the cats and the lists and the quizzes. And I think that's fine.
Jim, what's your most important piece of advice for young people who want to immerse themselves in the modern day media culture and get the best of both worlds?
Well, I suppose to put it in a slightly facetious way, and this is what I say to my own kids, that when you're online, you need to presume that every day is April Fool's Day. I think it's very, very important for everyone. And actually, I think this advice holds for older people as much as younger people who in many ways are much more media savvy, is we need to be discriminating, that the age of believing everything that you see and hear has now passed, and there is an incredible array and diversity of sources, which I think in the end is probably fantastic for journalism and creativity more broadly. But it's not always clear what people stand for behind what they publish, and people need to be very, very careful.
Now, in closing, Jim, as you head back to the BBC, could you do me a favour and have a quick look in the cupboard, see if there are any spare episodes of anything with Stephen Fry, because we're down to what seems like only about 4 hours a day at the ABC at the moment. I think we might need a little bit more. That's the CEO of BBC News Global, Jim Egan. Thanks for your time, Jim.
Thanks for having me on, Adam.
Now, I'm busy. You're busy. We're all busy. In fact, every now and then we'd probably go as far as to say we're feeling a little bit burnt out.